Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. I am so happy to have Valery Yakubovich from the Mack Institute. Valery, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So today we are going to talk about this amazing report that you have published this year, very fresh and extremely well laid out for a CEO to think about what type of tool sets they have at their disposal for innovation, for go-to-market, for value capture. But maybe first, Valery, if you can share your journey into corporate venturing. Why did you get interested by this topic?
It makes sense to say a few words about what our institute, as the full names says, we are Mack Institute for Innovation Management at Wharton. So we're interested in innovation. Our origins are in looking at how established companies innovate because they have a lot of challenges. So for us, it's a very kind of corporate venturing is one way to deal with emerging technologies for large corporations. So that's one reason we started looking into this. But also among my co-authors of the report, there is a Sergei Nitesin, our Wharton's senior vice dean for innovations. He thinks about how Wharton should innovate. But at the same time, in his previous appointment at INSEAD, he actually wrote another version of this report, maybe the first version, produced by a major business school in 2016. So when we started talking, we decided it's good time to revisit the topic and see what's going on. And finally, the third reason for us to do this is that everything we do at Mack Institute is based on faculty research. And we have excellent insights from our faculty into how innovations took place in business in the US and globally over long periods of time. And if we go far back in the early 20th century, the emergence of modern capitalism, Joseph Schumpeter at that time published a book which became known for its phrase creative destruction. So the original view of innovation, how it takes place, basically startups come in with new technologies, wipe out existing businesses, and reconfigure the whole industry anew. Then, about 30 years later, after the war, the same Schumpeter published another book, which was devoted to R&D in large corporations. And he stated that actually large companies are drivers of innovation because they now can internalize all these new technologies using R&D. It kind of after the war, it took off pretty significantly. And then our faculty came into this discussion recently. Of course, they aren't the first ones, but John Paul McDuffie, our Mack Institute director of the program on vehicle mobility innovation, started looking how now large automakers adjust to the emergence of electric cars. And they observe neither startups nor large companies taking over the whole industry, although some people expected that after Tesla, everyone will become Tesla. But actually, OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, large corporate automakers, they're doing their business. They're trying to figure out how to adjust, and they are adjusting with many challenges. So they call this kind of the third stage. Established companies post-war R&D, they call it Mark II. Now they observe Mark III, which is interactions between startups and established companies.
Nice. Valery, your report suggests that corporate venturing has moved from David versus Goliath battle to a more symbiotic partnership. I'm interested to hear why you think what was driving that shift.
Let's think about it. First of all, large corporations understand the threat. This idea that you can be disrupted, you might go disappear, basically, that's something they understand and see like they need to respond. The traditional response was R&D, but it turned out these modern technologies are so complex that actually doing this whole R&D in-house is extremely difficult. Second, even when your business is actually running smoothly, you still don't see where this threat. Okay, there is a new technology on the horizon, but I have an established business. It brings revenues. It's really hard to justify suddenly spending resources and major investment on something, right, that actually competes with your business. At the same time, for startups, these investments they need are huge. And by the way, we have this idea that VCs, traditional VCs, are the way to go to raise capital. But actually, the US is quite exceptional in this case.
Okay.
If you go beyond the US, you don't see such a vibrant VC ecosystem. Corporate capital is actually by default for many companies, for many startups, it's the where you go, right? And the state, right? Those players are much more important in investments in startups. It's really becoming for corporation for startups they need significant investments, and they need also strategic clients. Very often it's who first will get big client. It's a kind of with whom you can experiment, pilot, develop, even if your product is not perfect.
What's interesting about the shift you've described is it's really moving from disruption to partnership. And from, I think you have it as one of your key points about the report is it's no longer about just experimentation. It's actually part of the core strategy for a company.
I think what's happening, like CVC, let's start with CVC. Outside the US, it's actually for corporations to invest in startups, it was necessary for the startups ecosystem even to exist. But for the majority, it's a strategic choice. So that's the default, I would say, for most companies. CVC should be strategic. So that when they look at other areas of their activities, what used to be just supply chain management, right? Basically, you need suppliers. They realized over time that they can consider suppliers as they can learn from suppliers, learn about new technologies, and actually incorporate some of their suppliers into their vertical. They started thinking about startups as potential suppliers of key components, inputs, materials, with a possible integration and acquisition. So suddenly, this, what we call in the report venture clienting, became a strategic priority for the core business. And then finally, on one interesting entry point, which we discovered in the report, you start actually by providing business services. And so in this case, the startup is your actually client.
What I like about your report is in this podcast, we talk a lot about strategic value and objectives, but I think you laid out quite nicely according to 6 core corporate objectives. Do you mind maybe I ask you one by one? If we start with risk management, at TDK, our CEO, many activities like the corporate VC, he calls it pre-financial. And he calls it pre-financial because the intent is that we are going to learn things that then translate into financial objective for the full corporation. And it's interesting because when I started TDK Ventures, I was quite provocative. So we started with a $50 million fund, and people always ask the question, are you strategic or financial? And provocatively, I would say pure financial. With this $50 million fund, I want to bring billions of dollars revenue to TDK, which is the definition of strategic.
I see. Yeah, I mean, it's two sides of the same coin in some sense. Well, let's get back to your point about the risk. For us, basically, we mean the risk of disruption. For example, I would think is all kinds of IT services. Basically, you're a major provider of cloud computing or AI, whatever it can be. If you remember when OpenAI appeared with its GPT 3.5, it almost immediately announced this kind of creation of CVC, where they wanted to invest together with Microsoft, obviously, it's not their capital, invest in startups that are going to use their LLM, their large language model.
I'll touch on AI later because I know this is one of your interest topic. So the 6 corporate objectives, the number 3 is access to new technology. I think this is the one that most people think about, but it doesn't come for free.
Yeah, that's actually, you're totally right. It's the most conventional goal we see. Why do you want to engage with startups? It's usually more expensive to immediately deal with this yourself. So here I see like it's a cheaper access, relatively cheaper if you just put some money into some startup and then you see what's going on. You're exposed to what they're doing. You can assess it from as an outsider. So your losses in the worst case scenario are quite limited.
And then the next goal is to develop business ecosystem. I think you touched about this with OpenAI example, but this is really one where a corporation can, at extremely low cost, build an ecosystem of people engaging with your corporation.
Well, basically, for us, it's a very interesting goal in part because we have path breaking research and innovation ecosystems at Wharton. Some of our faculty really contributed major pieces into this whole literature, which had practical implications. The basic idea is we hear it actually everywhere. Big companies try to become orchestrators of ecosystems. Everyone talks now about their own thing as an ecosystem. Became very popular. What exactly does it mean? It means you have some focal value proposition, whatever your value you offer through your products and services, and then you're trying to identify startups, not necessarily startups, but in this case we're talking about startups, who can actually, by creating their value, they enhance yours. So obviously Amazon is the best example. They create the platform, they need the startups there who sell their things, and by doing that, they enhance the value of the platform. So platform is a common way to build an ecosystem, but is not the only way.
Now, I want to talk about the next goal, which is maybe a hot topic now. It's about the social and environmental impact. What about this goal today for a CEO starting? They care about the social impact or environmental impact. How should they think about corporate venturing?
Basically, the idea is to explore these issues on the outside as well. It's less disruptive for the main business. For example, if you care about some minority groups, you can help them develop their skills, their competencies, create opportunities for productive employment by supporting their startups. We have a number of examples of the companies in our sample that actually go to Africa, open incubators, accelerators, so some kind of workspaces for businesses that have nothing to do with their own business. But they feel because they're so present in that country, for example, when in Atlanta, a major business opened kind of new incubator for the businesses created by minority groups. It's faster, the impact might be much faster. You diversify your supply chain in terms of the representation of different groups. You diversify your customer base, which is important for you to be successful in a market which is diverse to start with. It's pretty much easier to gain traction if you do it with startups rather than just internally.
Now, the last of the six goals is about this is more internal in a way, but this is also difficult to, and maybe you can touch on that to judge or to assess, is to develop this entrepreneurial culture and capabilities inside the corporation.
Yes, we started with this, right? Established companies always struggled with innovation for a few reasons. One of them is the quality of human capital. As you work in an established business, you attract people who are more comfortable in established business. They like certainty. They want to minimize the risk to their welfare, to their earning potential, and so on. So there's some self-selection. And then if you want to innovate, it's hard because how do you bring this entrepreneurial spirit into this? Again, it's easier to do on the outside. Or one related concept which is popular right now is open innovation. You expose your internal workforce to entrepreneurial activities, engage them with entrepreneurs. They see how it works, they learn. Some of them might discover that they have their own entrepreneurial kind of taste for entrepreneurship. And gradually you change the culture by opening up your company to entrepreneurship. So that's the key idea behind this. What we find in the report now, it can be done in a variety of ways. One approach, which is venture building. When you go all the way in that direction and saying, okay, I don't just engage with startups, I will create a startup that I need. We'll create our own startup. And it's often created with employees who want to take some risk, but not necessarily. You can a diverse team of your internal people and external ones.
Valery, what I liked about your report also is that it showed what you call the 8 key corporate venturing practices. And what's nice is that you have four which are actually quite inexpensive They are light structured. Any CEO could decide to support these very light activities. And then there are four which are more heavy, which we will go afterwards. But I want to start with the light so that everyone feels that corporate venturing is not necessarily millions of dollars and a big dedicated team. Actually, there are things which are even before that, like mentorship, business services, workspace, and events. Can you speak to why a CEO could actually just start with that and already get value?
Yeah, basically, it's putting a foot in the door. If you're curious, if you're not doing much about with startups, you're not sure how it works, invite them to your premises, bring them in. What startups always struggle with, they want to know corporations' needs. And I understand why corporations very often are hesitant to talk to every startup. It's just too time consuming, really. So if you don't have any experience, start just organizing an event. Bring them in to do some pitch or some kind of competition, hackathon, to work on your problem which you are willing to publicize, or sponsor these things with the city or the kind of market where you work with. So it's a very easy way to start talking, learning without any obligations or any kind of expectations. So then shared space, shared workspace, it's another way to just bring your employees in contact with entrepreneurs. You have space at your company, startups are looking for space, just invite them to be there. And as we know, a lot of things happen at the water cooler, where you just interact, you get together just during the break, lunch, getting coffee, you start talking, and people learn from each other. Business services, I already mentioned, it's already you're meeting some of your needs. Basically, you have your clients, you have your customers, but you're paying attention to them not just as customers, but potential companies you want to invest in. So you're learning from interacting with them, selling your products or services, and then you see there is some potential there. You can engage in other ways. So again, here there is the cost is zero because you're already making money from these customers. And then mentorship is a way to share your expertise with the local community, entrepreneurial community, underrepresented groups among entrepreneurs like women, minorities. Companies see it as a corporate social responsibility, which is fine as well. Again, you meet multiple goals taking the same step.
Now let's go with the ones which are more structured, clearly more heavy, and the one that is a stronger commitment. And probably the CEO would want board support for that. And you talked already about all four, but can you go one by one and maybe the purpose of each and how they differentiate with each other?
Yeah, so in how our report is built, we start with CVC, which is the default option. And there, as we discussed, there are exposure to new technologies and financial gains are the main goals usually. What we see, as also I already mentioned, that unlike VCs, CVCs want to see some product market fit before they invest. It's not always the case, but I think it's a vast majority. And the time horizon is shorter. They want to see something not within 10 years, but maybe 3 to 5. Accelerators and incubators are a very common method. We see a lot of varieties in how this practice is used. Some are much more strategic, asking for quite a good fit to what the company already does. I see a variety of practices there. And by the way, when you have an accelerator incubator, mentorship, shared workspace, events, that are part of it. So all these initial entry points become components of a larger approach. Venture building, I already also said a few words, it's relatively small. And when we talk to, there's the whole kind of community of venture builders who can help companies do that. Either small companies, consulting kind of companies, or individuals, venture builders who come in and help companies to launch these things. Here, it's quite labor intensive. The resources necessary, but it requires attention, commitment, dealing with how much safety net do you provide to people who do this, how your internal constituency interacts with these entrepreneurs, and how what motivates them to contribute to success of these external ventures. So these are issues that need to be thought about. And actually, going to venture clienting, I would start with the same point. What I learned from some companies, when you engage in venture clienting, And very often it goes beyond your own needs. You also take startups and offer their products and services to your own clients, right? It's the next step. And here there is a trick. The leadership of the company has to figure out how to motivate their own sales force, because then they're thinking, okay, we have our own hard goals to sell things. Why are we going to offer something else and work to help these startups? So you need to think how all these things fit together, and this ecosystem approach is very useful, because then you can tell the sales force, look, you sell these products and services of our startups partners, and they enhance the value of our. You can easier sell what you are doing. Another important feature of this venture clienting practice: keep it separate from CVC. It's more they should be overseen by your line managers, because they have a stake in this. They understand what needs the startups are trying to address. They start with them, they can test them, they experiment with them, and come then to the leadership and say, look, this startup makes sense. Let's build a relationship with them and become their client. And very often CVC is kept aside to not confuse the interest of investing in them with the interest of becoming their strategic partner. As we know from a Microsoft OpenAI relationship, eventually it became everything. It's so multi-layered. We see so many different things. It's an interesting phenomenon on its own.
That makes sense. Now, my last question for you is, if we were to revisit this conversation, let's say in 5 years from now, what do you think will have changed most about how corporations engage with startups? And what do you think will still remain true?
I think the relationships will become very multi-layered. A lot of these developments are happening now in the context of digital transformation. This creates actually a lot of tools for engagement. Now, actually, OpenAI acts as an established business, but in some sense, it's still a startup, as we know. And Microsoft and OpenAI is an interesting case of what's coming. What for me is a very intriguing perspective is the role of AI. If it's true, these AI agents are coming, and in fact, I know there are experiments already with single person companies that consist of only AI agents. Can you launch a startup like that? In some sense, venture building might become easier. But it's, of course, maybe a bit longer term horizon. I think that venture clienting still has a potential. CVC will be with us, developing its kind of established practice. Venture building is the most tricky. And I think I see some kind of a plateau probably in the amount of these activities. My hypothesis is that it will remain more kind of a niche unless we have these digital companies now, totally AI driven, that might make it much easier and cheaper to launch a new business. So there are a lot of interesting things to explore going forward.
I can share with you an anecdote, which is, I think 3 weeks ago, I met a startup and I asked, how many people do you have in a team? And they responded, we have 22 team members, but 19 are humans and 3 are AI agents. So I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that mix. And what's interesting indeed for venture building, where you may not have all the skills available, AI agents could be a way to complement the skills very quickly, test the solution or the value proposition before you even think about recruitment of something very expensive to find. And if you think about recruitment of skills you don't have, this is actually the worst situations to recruit for.
Well, actually, I mean, the term digital twin has been around for a long time. But with AI in the play, we can now create digital twins of startups. You basically create a model and say, okay, go out there and see how you operate, whether this business in the digital space is taking off. Then we can take it into the real world, which is now more kind of augmented reality potentially. So there are a lot of possible ways in which it can develop. So I see the concept of digital twin now speaking to that kind of new way to experiment with all these practices.
Well, Valery, thank you very much for your time today and sharing some of the golden nuggets from the report. I invite everyone from the audience to check out the report. We are going to have an article about this interview. We will link to the report so that you can check it out. Valery, thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation, and I hope our listeners will learn something useful from this. Thank you.